How's it going? It's Anthony Cosenza, and this is another episode of the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. Happy to have you with us. It's the off season for the Cincinnati Bengals. It is not the off season for this show, nor is it for myself and my co-host John Sheeran. John, how you doing, buddy? New year, you kind of feel like you're back in the swing of things. Has the lethargy kind of worn off from the beginning of a new year that tends to set in?
It's kind of funny you open it with that. My roommate came in here about half an hour ago and said, "Hey, you want to watch a movie?" I'm like, "No, dude. You know I have a podcast to do every once in a while."
Look at that dedication.
And he's like, "You still do a podcast in the offseason?" I'm like, "Yeah, dude. Like we don't have much to talk about now, but we still got to do. We still got a job to do." And he's like, "You can talk about Joe Burrow?" And like, there's 4 months for that. We're gonna go in a different direction tonight.
Yeah, we've got a little bit to talk about. There might be a little Joe Burrow talk at the very end, given some recent comments by someone else in Bengals history, and we'll try and get to that if we can squeeze that in towards the end of the program. But we'll be talking about the status of the Bengals roster. John has a great breakdown that he has kind of used a little bit of a template from Paul Dehner Jr. of The Athletic, and
complete piggyback. Don't sugarcoat it.
Well, we're gonna make it our own. We're gonna do our own roster analysis, and we're gonna talk about some of the players based on the rumblings that we've heard about the team, the status of the roster going forward with the Cincinnati Bengals, areas of improvement that need to be had at what positions, that sort of thing. So we will go through that with a fine-tooth comb, as is kind of part and parcel of this point of the offseason. The Bengals are getting set to coach the Senior Bowl. We talked about that last week. They're going to be hitting free agency at the beginning of March, so just, a little over a month and a half away. And then, of course, you've got the draft towards the end of April. So, this is a critical time in terms of reviewing the roster, seeing free agents that are set to hit the market, guys you want to, that they want to keep, that sort of thing. So we will talk about that. We're going to continue our 2020 prospect watch list with a couple of guys that John and I have. And John, by the way, one of our listeners has an assignment for you at the Senior Bowl for a specific player. So we'll talk about that then too. I got to remind me to let you know about that, because
I will
one of our listeners has gotten in touch with us about that. So we'll talk about the two newest guys on our prospect watch list, and then we will end it with some other season awards. We kicked that off last week on the episode there towards the end, doing some MVP awards and whatnot. We've got some other season awards to give out, so we will do that. And then, as I mentioned, we may have time at the end for one other little recent piece of news that literally came our way right before we took the air. So we'll try and get that to you. If you're new to this show, you can get it on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, Megaphone, iHeartRadio. You may be tuning into us via our YouTube channel through the live video or Cincy Jungle's Facebook page. You may have found us on cincyjungle.com and found our video stream that way. All of it's good, so subscribe, check us out, try and join us live if you're able, whether it's for this weekly show, when we do the occasional listener questions episodes and or other breaking news, post-game analyses, although that's going to be a little bit down the road now, and other episodes that we do, as well as the other episodes within the Cincy Jungle channel, Matt Minnick's Chalk Talk and Orange is the New Black. So get to us how you can, and we appreciate the support.
So if our listeners are not subscribed to The Athletic yet, I would definitely recommend it. This podcast is not sponsored by The Athletic because they have their own Bengals podcast, but I digress. One of the reasons why, I guess if you want to read Joe Goodberry, if you really want to, there's a reason. But Paul Dehner Jr. and Jay Morrison have a lot of obviously valuable insight. And an article caught my attention earlier this week. Paul Dehner Jr. ran through the entire 53-man roster and about a dozen or so players on injured reserve who ended the season on injured reserve. And he basically categorized each player into 6 different, call them fates for this offseason. Number 1 is a future core player, a guy who they plan on having beyond 2020. Number 2, a complementary part, someone who's pretty much going to be on the roster for 2020 and may or may not start, but that's beside the point. Number 3, a bubble player for 2020, a guy who's going to be around the offseason but may not be a lock to make the roster. Number 4, a tradable piece, a guy that they're going to be looking to offload, someone who has value as a player, but just as value as a player of the Bengals, but someone who's valuable enough to acquire a draft pick. Number 5, an impending free agent who they're not sure they're going to bring back, someone that they're going to weigh their options. Maybe they can test the market, but someone who's definitely not a lock to be brought back. And number 6, parting ways, a guy that, is either on the bottom end of the roster or some guy that all the writings on the wall say that this guy's just not being brought back, even if he's a free agent or if he's still part of the roster. So Anthony brought up, if you have a subscription to Athletic, you've probably already read this. You probably already know a lot of these names and a lot of what we're going to talk about. But if you don't, I took the liberty of putting every player into an Excel spreadsheet, which if you're watching the YouTube show, you're seeing right now. Everybody is color-coded into their designated fates listed by Dana Jr. And just keep in mind that these are not his preferences, not what he would do, but just what he's been able to garner in terms of information from people part of the organization, what he's been able to gather from the locker room. Basically, all the information he's been able to accumulate, he's put into these projections. And this is basically what he came up with. And we're going through, the entire roster here. And we're just going to talk about the things that really stood out to me personally when I first read it. And, a lot of these are very logical. Like you have both Andy Dalton and AJ Green listed as trade pieces, John Ross as well. Guys who obviously, we all know what Andy Dalton's going to end up being. He's either going to be cut or he's going to be traded. That wasn't really surprising. AJ Green's probably going to be tagged, but, there could be teams calling about him. Same thing for, a John Ross or maybe even a Billy Price, guys who have disappointed but still have value because they were drafted high and they're still relatively talented players. The first thing that really didn't surprise me, but kind of took me back was the tight end position, and for 2 reasons. One, you have CJ Uzomah listed as a future core player. Now, I understand that he was signed to a 3-year deal. He still has 2 years left on his contract. But the reality is he just didn't play that well this year. And you look at some of these other names like a John Miller, who was also signed to a 3-year deal, and he played about as well as you could relatively expect him to play. He's listed as a bubble player. Now, there wasn't a lot of competition for Miller at that right guard spot, and he still played decently. But I think both of him and Uzomah should be categorized in the same designation, whereas Uzomah disappointed relative to how we should have expected him to play, not only as a pass catcher, but as a run blocker. The main area where he was, relied on to contribute, he really was, he regressed naturally in that area and was one of the reasons why the run game was so, piss poor towards the beginning of the season. But he's also listed as a future core player. And I think the main reason for that was it's almost like this Marvin Lewis type lingo or type coach speak where, maybe the on-field performance isn't exactly what's being valued here, but it's more of his natural presence as a locker room leader and as a teammate. And that's kind of where he's getting that value from. And while Uzomah is listed as a core player, you have Tyler Eifert listed as parting ways. Now, he's an impending free agent, but there was apparently rumblings on the wall that he's just not it's basically like a Kevin Zeiler situation where they recognize that he has increased his value, and it's gotten to the point where their decision to have him on this conservative play count or snap count has almost backfired against them, where he was completely healthy this year, produced relatively high compared to what he was expected to, and now he's kind of almost outplayed what they're willing to pay him, and it's almost to the point where he just doesn't really have a place here because they're probably not going to get him back on that 1-year deal, on that prove-it deal that he's been on for the past couple of years, and he's kind of almost outplayed that to the point where he's going to get some type of multi-year deal from another team, and it's probably not going to be the Bengals that match that. So you have Uzomah as the future core guy who's really not really earning up to his keep, and you have Eifert, the guy who outplayed him this year, almost now with two feet out the door on as an impending free agent. So that was really the first thing that kind of stood out to me.
The tight end position always confuses me about the Cincinnati Bengals and how they approach it, what they do with it. CJ Uzomah listed as a future core player. It's surprising for a lot of the ways that you mentioned, but it's also not surprising because he was one of the earliest guys they signed in free agency right away. They gave him a big pay jump. Now, granted, he hit some decent statistics the year prior in 2018 when Eifert was hurt, and he was kind of the primary guy at tight end. He had 43 catches, 439 yards, and 3 scores. He did not play as well this year, but as did Eifert, he started to pick up steam in the passing game towards the end of the year. He started to make some more plays at the end of the year. Took a dip overall, 27 catches, 242 yards, 2 touchdowns. What's a little concerning to me, in the previous 4 seasons where he's actually played in ample games and had some targets, 66%, 66 to 67% catch percentage in terms of, targets and actual receptions. That's a little concerning to me from a position that should be a security blanket, one where you should hit high percentage passes a lot of the times, and a position where you should create some mismatches. I'll say this about Uzomah, sticking with him. Basically, from when the Bengals started playing a lot better and on, the first half of the season, I guess, 14 catches. I'm sorry, not 14 catches, 14 targets. He had 9 catches in the first 8 games. Okay, 9 catches, 0 touchdowns. Final, obviously, he had 18 catches in the final 8 games and the 2 touchdowns in the final 2 weeks. The final 5 weeks, 5 catches, 1 catch, 1 catch, 4 catches, 5 catches. So much like a lot of the other players in the system or on the team, he played a bit better down the stretch. So maybe that's why they view him as one of the core players. I don't want to belabor this point on this position because I know you got a lot more to get to on this. I'm a little surprised about Ethan Carter. That's something to me. I feel like you maybe are getting some of the same stuff that you would from a Drew Sample. Maybe they feel that Drew Sample is going to be the next Eifert. I don't see the athleticism. I don't see the hands. I don't see all of that Eifert gives you. But if he is a complementary part, which would mean that Uzomah is the core guy, Sample's the complementary guy, they obviously have some big plans for him in the passing game next year, I would think. But that's a position group, as you mentioned, that will probably need a player. If Eifert does indeed go, there's probably going to need to be a high day 3 pick used at the position, I would think, in the draft.
I think you have Carter listed with Sample because he's a restricted free agent, so all I have to do is tender him and he'll be back. And I also think that just looking at their special teams players and who they rely on there's a reason why Carter made the team in the first place. It was because special teams, so they must still like him there as well. And the thing with Sample, the whole head scratching nature behind drafting Sample was the fact that they brought back Eifert, they re-signed Uzomah, they had guys like Carter and Mason Streck there. So why bring in Sample when you're only going to have one tight down the field at all times? I think their willingness to implement him more and increase his role more so in 2020 is the reason why they don't see themselves re-signing Eifert, because again, Eifert is probably going to make a little bit more money. He might be tempted to sign a multi-year deal with some other team who's willing to take that risk. So that was my biggest disconnect. That's where I thought the biggest disconnect was between the fan base and where the organization sees on a certain position. We already touched a little bit on the offensive line. The whole thing with that right now is that you have Trey Hopkins Trey Hopkins and Jonah Williams as the only guys that you can sharpie in terms of who's going to start. Obviously, Williams at left tackle, Hopkins just signed a 3-year deal at center. Those are your core players. Apparently, they like Michael Jordan to start at left guard more than they're more comfortable with letting him start at left guard more so than John Miller. We already talked about Miller as well. The Miller thing makes sense to me because it's they basically signed Miller to a 3-year deal last year, but it was basically to just solve that problem for 1 year and kind of readdress it in 2020. So if they go out in the draft and maybe get a guard in rounds 2 through 4, or maybe sign some type of veteran in free agency to give Miller some competition, I'm definitely open to that because Miller is not a guy that you want to have as your second or third best offensive lineman. He's fine if he's your fourth or fifth best offensive lineman. If that's the case, then you probably have a decent unit on your hands, but he's obviously not the type of player that you can say we're definitively comfortable with him starting. So that's fine. With Bobby Hart, though, he is listed as a complimentary player, which basically means he's going to make the team in 2020. It's just a matter of if he's going to start it or if he's going to be that swing tackle. And that was kind of the rumors, I guess, last year when they drafted Williams. And I think he's listed as that mainly because of how Fred Johnson played, who's listed as a bubble player. But that essentially means that he's going to be back in the offseason and he's going to compete. And I don't know if they're comfortable with having just those two guys compete at right tackle, But I think with how Johnson played, it opens the door for Hart to not be the starter, and it really will just depend on their aggressiveness in terms of how they want to address competition at that spot. Because if you just have Williams and Hart and Johnson, you're probably likely to add at least one more. It just may not be this expensive free agent or the second round pick that maybe some fans want to happen.
You know what this list tells me, based on what Daner has been hearing and based on what our eyes tell us and based on what even what we saw at the end of the year, where we saw some improvement on the offensive line that didn't have a Jonah Williams, that Cordy Glenn was kind of cycled in and out of the lineup. Billy Price, same thing. John Miller missed a game with an injury, but there was still some improvement. You know what this list tells me, though, John? Even with our optimism at, hey, they were able to run the ball and this and that and the other thing, these positions need work, man. They need players. They need players, and they need investments again. And, 2 years after they take Billy Price in the first round, they're going to need, within the first 3 rounds at least, to probably take an offensive tackle or an interior offensive line, if not both. And I think if you're going to take Joe Burrow, you better make damn sure that you're going to protect that investment. And you better make damn sure that you bring in guys who can play. If you think Fred Johnson can play, great. And if he proves to you that he can play, great. But you better give that kid, Joe Burrow, the best chance possible to succeed. And when you have 5 guys that are quote unquote parting ways, another guy that's a tradable piece, and 2 other guys that are bubble, that's not a good state of the offensive line to me. So
you didn't mention Bobby Hart, who's none of those.
Right.
So yeah, people who can see Cordy Glenn, like, he's listed as parting ways. I think everybody kind of assumed that, even with him coming back and the offensive line improving, it's still Jonah Williams, is spotted left tackle, and they still like Hart enough to give him competition there. So the areas for Glenn to start on this offensive line, I think, have not all been evaporated, but essentially have been, they're gone. Like, they like Michael Jordan enough, obviously left guard, and that was the spot that Glenn could have taken. The whole thing with him has gone to the point where he's just not going to be around, and with him being a free agent, they can't really trade him. So that's basically an inevitability. But there are some free agent decisions. The majority of free agent decisions are going to come from the defensive side of the ball. And one area that was interesting to me was the interior defensive line. They have both Daner listed both Carlos Dunlap and Geno Atkins as complementary players. And I think partly because, they're not, since they're on the other side of 30, it's more of, they're not necessarily a part of the long-term future, and they only have, at this point, 3 or 2 years left on their respective deals. And the fact that Dunlap, exploded onto the scene so much kind of saved him from being potentially a tradable piece. And that second half of the season really saved his skin in terms of him still being a part of the defensive line. But the thing that stood out to me was Josh Tupou, who's a restricted free agent, listed as a complimentary piece, and Andrew Billings listed as the free agent decision. So essentially, the discussion there is that both Tupou and Billings are kind of redundant players in terms of they both do similar things. They can both be used in similar ways. And it just seems easier to just tender Tupou and let Billings test the market. I think they would like to bring Billings back because he's still a solid player, and they still have some depth issues on the defensive line. But when everyone's healthy, you have Rennell Wren, who you drafted last year. You still like Ryan Glasgow, what he can do. You have potentially Niles Scott coming back from free agency, even though he doesn't see Niles Scott being brought back. And you still have Atkins and Tupou as well. So you have a lot of bodies there that when everyone's healthy, there's not a lot of diversity there. And it's kind of not silly, but some resources can be used better than bringing back both Billings and Tupou. And I think since it will be easier to retain Tupou, I think that's why you have him designated as that, and why Billings is probably more on the outside looking in than vice versa.
Interesting stuff on the defensive line. I thought, just to kind of echo your sentiments, I thought over the past couple of seasons I've seen some maybe a little bit marginal but noticeable improvement from Andrew Billings and Josh Tupou. Granted, they are limited. They are 2 down at most players. They are run stuffers. But, as the team kind of played a little bit better towards the end of the year, I saw some things out of both of those guys that I liked. You said there's a lot of carbon copies in the interior line, right? You've got the two kind of active penetrating guys in Gino and Glasgow, and then you've got the wild card in Renell Wren, and then you've got the two big boys who are your run guys, your Pat Sims type of guys in Josh Tupou and Andrew Billings. So, I look at it and I see my concern with Glasgow is he's been on IR the past 2 years with knee injuries. So, I like what the defensive line is clearly better when he's active and he's in games. It's very proven, and it was much more proven in 2018. But I worry about the longevity there. I don't know what's in store for him. He seems like a promising player, but I'm a little worried there. To go to the edge players, I agree about Dunlap. I'm really interested about Andrew Brown. He kind of showed some things both in the preseason, a little bit in the regular season as a guy you can move around a bit. So I'm really interested to see what's in store for him going forward.
Absolutely. And I think for the most part, the defensive line doesn't really move the needle or shock us in any way. Hubbard is listed as the future core player. They can't extend him this year, but if they could, I believe they would try to get him as in the cheapest deal possible. Now going into the back seven, linebacker I think is in the same vein as defensive line. There's nothing too surprising here. The only one that you can have any relative confidence going forward in is Jermaine Pratt. He's listed as a complimentary part. He's going to be on the team. He's probably going to start because they just might not have enough good enough bodies to have him compete for that starting job. They're going to have Jordan Evans on the bubble, which makes a lot of sense. He's entering last year of his deal. Hardy Nickerson, Leroy Reynolds. Yeah. Well, get out. Basically, you're done. Nick Vigil is the intriguing aspect here because as an impending free agent, you would think that along with Reynolds and Nickerson, he would be shown the door as well. Not even interested in bringing him back, but just like some of these other guys, he had a promising second half of the season, and not like completely. Looking back to how he started 2019, he was one of the worst linebackers in the NFL, and that was kind of along the same lines of how he played in 2018. But he also looked a lot improved, and you have to wonder how much of getting rid of Preston Brown really benefited Jermaine Pratt and Nick Vigil and putting them in the right positions to play. I think that if I had to guess, they're going to offer him some type of 1 year prove-it deal, just kind of like what they did with Dennard last year. Obviously, with Dennard, it was more of he was dealing with an injury and he overvalued himself. That's why he couldn't get any type of long-term deal on the open market. With Vigil, the interest is also probably not going to be that much there because he just hasn't put good enough tape out there. But with the way he ended this year and with the complete liquidation of that position group for this year, I think they don't want to just go into the draft with Pratt and Evans as the only guys who played on this team last year at the position. I think Vigil is going to get offered some type of 1 year deal, and it's just a matter of if he wants to bet on himself or try to extend his career someplace else.
Agreed. I still would like to see if they're going to run the 3 linebacker set, I would like to see both Vigil and Pratt out there, and maybe another guy that's kind of in I don't know. I just view those guys as good complementary pieces whose play will rise even further with another stud in there, whoever that may be. A guy that can kind of free them up and make them look a little bit, maybe even look a little bit better than they actually are. If that statement makes any sense. I see those guys as good parts to a whole, but you're still missing that one guy, right? You're still missing that one guy who's kind of your captain of your defense, a perfect in his prime type of player. These two guys I feel can be decent to pretty good players, but they're still missing that one guy. I agree with you. I wouldn't break the bank by any means or go on a long-term deal for Nick Vigil, but if the price is right and you feel that you can get him along with maybe another linebacker in free agency that makes sense and you can solidify that group, I would be in favor of that. But that price has definitely got to be right. This can't be a Bobby Hart type of contract. This can't be a what was that type of deal.
And it's a very delicate situation because, you think about you don't want to force linebacker to be the second round pick if there's not the right player for that. But it's also like if they want some type of quality starter, they're going to have to spend more in free agency than they're accustomed to spending. So how they handle that position is going to be crucial in terms of how this defense gets better. Finally, in terms of shock value, I guess we can look at cornerback position, which is where this last major potential question mark becomes. You have Darius Phillips as your complementary part. Makes sense. He's basically penciled in as a starter for next year. BW Webb on the bubble. He played an incredibly up and down season. More downs than ups,
yeah.
I think we can say. But he's still under contract for 2 more years. Then you have Drake Kirkpatrick and William Jackson, both listed as tradable pieces. Now, Kirkpatrick should surprise nobody. He's got the 3rd highest cap hit on the team. He's always been incredibly inconsistent. If they trade him or cut him this year, they're dealing with minimal dead cap. He still has value as a spot starter in this league somewhere. If the value and demand is right for him, they can get some type of trade or draft pick for him. The William Jackson one is interesting because he is coming off his shoulder surgery now. He's not going to be healthy until sometime in the spring. He's entering, he's playing on his 5th-year option now. So he's almost like he could be in line for an extension, or I guess he could be in line for playing for another team. And Daniel's reasoning behind this is that I'm reading the article right now. He's been disinterested here, and if the team isn't sure if he's willing to offer a long-term deal after the season, this could be the time to get something for him. So essentially, this offseason would be the time to maximize whatever value Jackson has, because unfortunately, he just hasn't been playing up to the level that he showed in 2017. And now maybe that level was too high to expect for him to play for the rest of his career. Obviously, it was an incredible year according to Pro Football Focus, but even still, like the ending of 2018 was still pretty good. And I think people think that he's still talented enough. It's just a matter of, does he fit what they want to do here, and does he fit in terms of culture and stuff. And that's, I think, why you have guys like Uzoma listed as future core players, and you have a guy as talented as William Jackson as a potential tradable piece. It goes beyond, I think, what we see on the field and whether or not he's just picking up what the coaches are putting down. And if that's the reason why it's just not translating onto the field. So I think we all would like to think that William Jackson is going to start for this team because he's still incredibly talented as a cornerback. But if they get a valuable offer from another team and he plays an incredibly valuable position, I think that's why he's got this designation on him.
Is there any inkling as to or clarification as to what he means by disinterested?
No.
Yeah, I saw him say that. I believe it was on Twitter, and I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to say it, and I'm like, I don't want to put words in his mouth if it wasn't Daner that had actually said it. But yeah, I mean, I remember seeing that, and I was like, disinterested. What does he mean by that? This to me is, a lot of this stuff. I mean, we talked about Uzama being kind of a little bit of a surprise, and the offensive line maybe being a little worse off than we thought it may have been towards the end of the year. But this is a position group that quietly has not only disappointed, but has obviously, I mean, you're looking here, Phillips, it's a possibility that Phillips is one of the only guys left in the group. Now I don't see an offseason where the Bengals would shed Webb, Kirkpatrick, Jackson, and Denard all in one offseason. That would be just, that would cripple that position group. But I mean, I think that there might be some major movement here. I thought Darqueze Denard played well when he was in there. It was a real bummer that he missed. I think this team missed him when he was on the PUP. But I a guy I'd like to see back, but he brings a different set of skills than Kirkpatrick and Jackson. You keep waiting for Jackson to hit this Pro Bowl stride. It seems like he's got all these tools. He's got the speed, and whether it's the health, the lack of the big plays, the lack of corralling interceptions, any of that stuff, he just hasn't brought it. He's been pretty good, right? Some of the metrics, like you mentioned, with Pro Football Focus show that he's been very good, but some of those big plays are still lacking. And, you kind of had maybe envisioned a Leon Hall, Jonathan Joseph type of redux with some of these guys in there, and it didn't really happen. I don't think that both Kirkpatrick and Jackson are gone, I think you will get a much higher yield for Jackson than you would Kirkpatrick in terms of trade value. If I'm a betting man, I would say probably Kirkpatrick and Webb would be gone. They may try and push to re-sign Denard. They keep Jackson for another year, and then obviously give Phillips kind of a bump in a role. That's kind of how I would see that. Bring in some other help, but this position group's very, very intriguing how that's going to play out. And oh, by the way, speaking of BW Webb, if you want to look back up to the edge defender, Kerry Wynn showing parting ways. These are the Lou Anarumo guys. These are the guys that have the Lou Anarumo connection that they had big hopes for his system, and not much of an impact at all from either of them, unless it was a negative one.
Yeah, like I think Dennard is the one free agent here that you're going to see being brought back on a multi-year deal, if anybody, because he was, by and large, one of the better slot cornerbacks in the league when he was healthy. He was just productive in terms of receptions per coverage snap and in terms of run defense. Everything that they expected Dennard to be, he was this year. And I get it, he only played half the year because of injuries, but he ended the year healthy, and I think that matters more now since he had an injury to end last year, and that's why it affected his free agency status. But out of all of these guys listed in orange, Andrew Billings, Nick Vigil, Nick Vigil, Darquez Dennard, CJ Fedulum, I think Dennard is the most likely to be brought back on some type of multi-year deal, some type of guaranteed money attached to them. And you're right, like there's a reason why the Bengals, I think, claimed the Packers cornerback off their practice squad and the CFL leader in interceptions, both at cornerback positions to end the year as their last act as at the top of the waiver order. You're going to see a lot of turnover at this position. I don't think either Greg Maben, Torrey McTyer, or Tony McRae are coming back. I think a couple of them are like restricted free agents, and you're gonna get some competition for BW Webb. And regardless if he's traded or not, I don't think Drake or Patrick's coming back either. I think they want to use that cap space to their advantage and give Darius Phillips a chance to start. So Jackson is probably only traded if they get an offer they can't refuse. Dennard's probably going to be negotiating a multi-year deal with the team, and BW Webb's future is kind of in the balance. And that's why you kind of have you kind of see the writing on the wall already with the signing of those two young cornerbacks to kind of rebuild the depth that is going to be torn apart in the coming months.
Yeah, and I mean, otherwise, there's not a ton of other surprises. I mean, a little bit of a surprise that Sean Williams is listed as a core guy. I thought he took a big step back this year. Jesse Bates, for the first half of the year, took a big step back, but really played nice football towards the end of the year there. Brandon Wilson, interesting. I think he is probably going to, especially with a potential rise in prominence by Darius Phillips on defense, Brandon Wilson's probably going to get the nod in terms of value with the club as a special teamer, a return man, obviously a reserve safety. Really like Fedulum, especially what he does on special teams, an unheralded guy. And, I hope they seems to be an affordable guy they can bring back. Maybe some people would say that he's a dime a dozen. You can find guys like that in the draft, but he's played well for them in kind of a reserve special teams role, I think. So I'd like to see him back. And then, the special teamers, they may bring in another kicker, but Bullock had probably one of his best seasons as a professional kicker, like him or not. He had statistically one of his best seasons as a pro kicker. And one of the things with special teams, especially now that Darren Simmons got a contract extension, they want continuity there. And they want their trio of long snapper, punter, kicker all on the same page, because that's your snapper, your holder, obviously your place kicker, your snapper, and then your punter. I mean, these guys all work in unison. So obviously there's something there that Simmons really likes in terms of a synergy.
Absolutely. Anything else that stands out to you on this list?
Not particularly. I just, I think we tended to. I'll go one other spot that is one of the deepest positions, and you look at running back, and I think Rodney Anderson, if he can stay healthy, that's why I said if like 17 times. If he can stay healthy, I think he can be a good complementary piece. I thought Travion Williams, especially with Anderson going down, I thought he may get a couple more looks, a couple more touches on offense, but, he didn't really show much. Bernard is who Bernard is. We know who he is. The thing that's interesting to me, John, is future core Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon is entering what is his, I believe, his last year of his rookie deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he has made it known he wants to be here. He has, whether you want to truly believe him or not, I take him at his word. He is a rah-rah guy. He has back-to-back 1,100-yard seasons. I find it interesting that he's labeled as a future core. Does that mean to you that he's in the plans for a long-term deal?
It's the same thing with Hubbard. I think that they want to get both of those guys extended as soon as possible. They're going to be it's probably going to happen after if they extend AJ Green, it's probably going to start after that, or in terms of picking up steam, it's going to start after that, because there's a possibility that Mixon holds out. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm not holding him against it. I think it's a possibility, and I think that they realize that, okay, with how he played at the end of this year, the fact that we're going to have some more money to work with, we're going to have some more immediate cash to dispense. There's a possibility that this guy could potentially sit out and miss a couple of games. They're gonna be in the works for doing that. I think that both Daner Jr. and Jay Morrison have heard that that they want to work out an extension with him. There's obviously an agreement on both sides that they want to get a deal done. I think that's why you have him labeled as this, with how he's played and with the rumblings about what's going to happen. It's a matter of if he's signed before the season or if he's potentially missing games for a holdout. It's weird that we see this with running backs, but it's also not weird because they want to get their money as quick as possible. And with Joe Mixon, he's turning 24 this summer. He's still got presumably a few more good years left, and he wants to maximize off that. And the Bengals realize that they're going to have some more space to deal with, and I think that's why you have him listed here, because an extension would mean he's part of the team for the next 4 or 5 years, or however long that deal is. So with how he's played and with the rumblings of what's going to happen, I think that didn't really surprise me that much, even considering he's going into a contract year.
Yeah, wide receiver is also an interesting spot on this list. So I guess I'll end it with this, John, and ask you this question. There are 6 yellow players on here, meaning they're listed as tradable pieces. Given the fact that this is still a team that has some Marvin Lewis guys on it, given the fact that this is a team that obviously Zach Taylor wants to put his stamp on, and a team that needs still a lot of work at offensive tackle, interior line, linebacker, potentially cornerback, wide receiver, quarterback, how many of those people, I mean, do you see a lot of trades being, maybe even throw Cordy Glenn in there, the value would be low, what you would net for him, but he might be a guy you try and trade. So 6 or 7 guys that are potential trade guys. How many of these do you see actually being executed?
I don't think they can trade Glenn anymore because he's going to be a free agent. But
he is going to set to be a free agent. I thought he had another year. But
wait, you're right. Yeah.
Regardless,
he has no dead money, so essentially he can be treated as a free agent, but they can still trade him because he's got 1 year left on this deal. I think it's going to take a lot of wheeling and dealing, but I think they're going to be able to find a trade partner for Dalton. I don't think they're going to trade Green. I think they're just going to leave that door open in terms of a leverage tactic, but I think we're going to see him go all the way to July before that deal is with him on the franchise tag. I don't think they're going to be able to find a trade partner for Kirkpatrick. I think he's destined to get cut at this point. And I think the same thing goes with, in terms of William Jackson, is also you can apply for John Ross, where they recognize that there's value there from another team's perspective, but they also recognize the value that he could still potentially have to this team. You have to wonder if they want to see him with an improvement under center at quarterback and how he can expand upon his game in his 4th year. I think the most likely out of these is Andy Dalton. And to round it out, Billy Price probably has the least amount of value out of here, but they still want to market him as a former first-round pick, someone who could potentially compete as a starter. If they can get anything for Billy Price, I would advise them to take it. Just eat the dead money that they have. I think cutting him or trading him would cost them about $3 or $4 million in dead money, which is a lot for one player when you're talking about the Bengals, who typically end the year with around $5 million total dead money. So that would be uncharacteristic of them. But if they can get anything, I would definitely advise them to do so. But definitely, if I were to bet any money on any of these guys getting traded, it's definitely going to be Dalton.
So you would probably say maybe less trades than maybe what some people would think based on. Okay. I'd agree with that. Good stuff, John, and good stuff to Paul Daner Jr. of The Athletic for putting that together. We wanted to put our own spin on that. So good stuff from you, John. Good analysis there, and we hope you enjoyed that. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. He's John Sheeran. I'm Anthony Cosenza. Get this podcast on any number of audio platforms, wherever you download your podcasts. Subscribe to our channel. Get our show along with other shows in the Cincy Jungle Network. Also, check out our YouTube channel and try and join us live either via YouTube, Cincy Jungle's Facebook page. It's also up on cincyjungle.com. And, of course, keep it to cincyjungle.com for all your news, opinions, analysis, and Bengals insight. Let's move on, John. We've done a series of these with a number. We should probably keep a list of who we've done. I mean, we've done a lot of these, both of our own analysis and with help of others from the SB Nation Network. We did the big three quarterbacks and Justin Herbert, Tua Tagovailoa, and Joe Burrow. By the way, Tua did declare for the draft, so he is entering the draft for those who do not know. We did a couple of offensive linemen, a wide receiver, and an edge rusher. So we've got a lot. So go back to our older episodes if you missed any of that, and check out some of the player profiles that we have done. John, I'm going to let you kick it off this week with your prospect. Unless you're uncomfortable, I can kick off.
No, it's best for the ill-prepared guy to lead off with this presentation.
Okay, so all right. Hey, get the jitters, the presentation jitters out. Right?
So I'm going to stick with I'm going to go a Senior Bowl guy this week and a Senior Bowl guy next week to prepare for the Senior Bowl in 2 weeks. And I'm going to start with AJ Green. No, not the receiver, the cornerback out of Oklahoma State. A 4-year player out of Oklahoma State. I think he fits a lot about what they would look for at the position. I know one cornerback a couple weeks ago with AJ Terrell of Clemson who had a decent game against Ohio State. But if they don't bring back AJ Green for this year, they can always replace that name on the roster with a cornerback who's going to be at the Senior Bowl out of Oklahoma State. I like his production for starters. He had 3 consecutive years at Oklahoma State with 39 solo tackles. Believe it or not, solo tackles is a good indication of production in terms of success in the NFL for cornerbacks specifically. It's solo tackles and pass deflections. And over his 3 years where he started at Oklahoma State, 21 pass deflections, 6 interceptions. I think he led the Big 12 interceptions in 2017 with 4. So, you say what you want about the Big 12. Production is production, whether it's inflated or not. There's some skill sets to like about this guy. I mean, 6'1", 190. He could be listed more on the under, maybe not 190, maybe more close to 185. Could be listed in terms of more on the other sides, but has a lot of experience in these cover one, single high safety type of coverage concepts or whatever. He's very comfortable backpedaling. He's very comfortable playing with his eyes towards the ball. Very comfortable being left in zone. Is able to just pound down on these in-breaking routes in terms of backpedaling and then clicking and closing. The ball skills are obviously still there with the amount of ball production that he's had over the course of his 3 years. The athleticism is evident. He can flip his hips very easily. He can run with those vertical routes. But just kind of like it was with Terrell, the strength at the catch point can kind of come into his way a little bit. The lack of size is obviously concerning. You have to wonder, he played on the boundary so much in college, but maybe he won't be able to get away with that in the NFL, where he had to use that length and that lack of size in the slot to maximize whatever potential that he has. But I think you always have to look at experienced guys with a lot of ball production and a lot of production around the ball, whether it be solo tackles or getting your hands on the ball. Again, it's the Big 12, and you can devalue defensive players if you want. But, Bengals fans should be interested by the name for starters. But a good athlete with a lot of production. He's going to test well prior to the combine. We get to see him extensively at the Senior Bowl. I think this guy has a lot of traits to be potentially a late second round or a late day 2 or early day 3 draft pick, depending on how he tests and how he looks in these offseason workouts. Just a guy to watch for.
Any idea on 40 time or potential 40 time, anything like that? Is he quick? Is he fast, or is he more quick than fast? I mean, I'm looking at some of his stats, and we've got it up on the screen here. I mean, I'm looking. I love the sophomore year, 39 solos, 4 interceptions, 5 pass defense. But I also like the next year, 11 passes defense as a junior. So I mean, I like some of that stuff, but just curious about some of the measurable stuff that may come with.
So, like, obviously one of the most athletic cornerbacks as possible. I don't think he's going to blaze an incredible 40 time there. I think it's going to be more in the mid to the late 4.4s in terms of best case scenario. It's all about traits, though. So, like, if your cornerback isn't the fastest, but if he runs, good agility drills in terms of a 3-cone short shuttle, there's value in that. I think the explosion is going to come off the screen at Indianapolis at the combine. I think it's going to be, in terms of an all-around athletic profile, which is kind of dangerous to do. It needs to be weighted properly with that lack of size. He's probably going to measure in under 195 pounds, but I think we're going to see decent speed, decent agility at the combine.
Yeah, Michael Flukas in the live Facebook chat said I thought he had issues with his recovery speed. I don't know if you've seen anything like that on tape, but
again, he's not a blazer, and he sometimes loses the ball, and even for being as experienced he does have some shortcomings. We're not talking about a potential first round player here, but it's somebody that I'm definitely going to be watching in one-on-ones at the Senior Bowl, because that those drills are designed for receivers to get easy separation, and you can really tell which cornerbacks are able to handle that that type of quickness off the line. And we're going to see how good he is up against line scrimmage, because he's been most comfortable playing off the ball in those zone concepts. So seeing him in press coverage and bump run coverage is going to be a great test to see how diverse of a skill set that he has at the position.
Sounds good. You do have a from listener Ken Dipple. He has been asking us for about a week now about Antonio Gandhi Golden from Liberty. He's a wide receiver. He wants to know about him, seeing as how you are going to the Senior Bowl, and this is a small school kid. He is huge. He's 6'4", 220, kind of an Auden Tate type of guy. So you don't necessarily have to do a full-blown report, but we've got a little assignment for you. If you can keep an eye on that player for us, that would be awesome. And let us know what you think about him, because our listener is very, very curious about that.
Yeah, I will only look at a Liberty player if somebody asks me to.
Okay. Yep. So I'm going to go. A couple of weeks ago, I previewed a wide receiver in Michael Pittman Jr., and he is a guy that also, I mentioned Auden Tate. He kind of has a little bit of a similar skill set, the big body, kind of the up, vertical routes and 50-50 balls, and, maybe a short, quick screen pass type of guy, and, maybe a little bit of a limited route tree, but a big body, decent hands, and high production while he was at USC. I'm going to stick in the Pac-12 with another receiver, but a guy who can do more things, and a guy who is really, he's one of my favorite players in the draft. He really is, because he's just fun. And if you have the key with this player is to have somebody with a creative offensive mind that's going to commit certain amount of touches and creative ways to get this player the football. And it's wide receiver out of Colorado, Laviska Shenault Jr. He is 6'2", 220. He's a big-bodied guy. He can run pretty well. Some people are saying he may crack the low 4.4s, maybe mid 4.4s. He's had a couple little nicks and injuries in his career with the Buffaloes, but a guy that just, he just is fun to watch. Sometimes you see a player and Shenault's a guy who's been listed as maybe a late one, a guy who's maybe early second round, that sort of thing. So if the Bengals end up maybe trading an AJ Green, trading a John Ross, or both, if they end up losing those guys, this may be a position all of a sudden of real prominence, of need to go with a Tyler Boyd, Auden Tate, that sort of thing. This is a guy who can do things out of the Wildcat. This is a guy who can, help you out in a number of different ways, stretch the field, do the short passes, and do a number of fun things. But like I mentioned, he's going to need an offensive mind to help get him the ball. Now you look at it and you go, well, compared to some other wide receivers, there's the big 2018 season in 9 games where he had 86 catches and over 1,000 yards. He had the big plays on the ground, and you see 11 total touchdowns that year. Only 4 receiving touchdowns this year in 11 games. but you see there are times where there's big playability. You see the stuff out of the shotgun and the wildcat where he's lined up in the backfield and can score touchdowns. So a guy I think that can be a real fun player for a team, and a guy that can, be kind of a Swiss Army knife type of player for a team. I worry that the Bengals staff, if they were to draft a guy like that, we've seen the Bengals draft fun players from college before and not utilize them properly, or they let them waste away behind veterans and that sort of thing. This is a guy you need to get the ball, you need to create opportunities for this guy. You really need to create opportunities for him. Maybe even as a return man early on. He didn't have many of those opportunities, but the couple of times he did return punts and kicks, they were big plays. So I really like this kid, John. I don't know how well he will test. I think he'll have decent straight line speed. I think you'll see some decent numbers and maybe the shuttles and whatnot, but good hands. Kind of a big, to me, maybe not so much in the return game, but a bigger bodied Percy Harvin, a guy that can just do a lot of different things for an offense. The floor, unfortunately, is probably a Cordero Patterson. So I don't know if you want to think about using a high second round pick on a player like that, especially if you're the Cincinnati Bengals. The point may become moot if you bring back AJ Green, you keep John Ross. Maybe you don't need a guy like this, but a fun player to watch, and a guy that can bring a different dynamic to an offense.
My whole thing with receivers specifically who don't end up dominating at where they play. Now, 1,000 yards is basically like we've attached 1,000 yards to this arbitrary degree of success when we haven't really contextualized what that really means in the grand scheme of an offense. In 2018, Colorado, I believe, looking this up right now, so they had about 3,000 passing yards in that year. So 1,000 yards is pretty good for a receiver who, just looking at, so he was the feature receiver of that 2018 Colorado team, which is good for him. It shows that an offense can flow through him, and that's indicative of potential success in the NFL. For both for guys who haven't really done that consistently throughout the course of their career, I wonder if their athleticism and if their type of skill set can translate into the NFL. Because for a guy who you want to compare to Percy Harvin, not necessarily that that's a stone cold comparison, but Percy Harvin was this crazy athlete that could just do anything that he wanted on an NFL field when he was perfectly healthy. He could run past guys, he could make guys miss. It really comes down to, for some of these guys who need specific ways to win, it'll come down to how their athleticism can translate. Because for a lot of receivers who, or more big body guys that can kind of just out muscle guys at the catch point in college, that skill set becomes harder to translate in the NFL. You look at guys like, Mike Williams and Laquan Treadwell. For some it works, for some it doesn't. For like DeAndre Hopkins, he's managed to make an NFL, he's been become an NFL star off of that one skill set. But for some guys who can't necessarily separate based off of any type of above average athleticism trait, it becomes hard for that production to translate into the NFL. So the size definitely intrigues me. That 1 year of production at Colorado intrigues me. So those are both good signs for him. It's just the fact that he wasn't as consistent with that production is worrisome. And I wonder if he's going to have that one athleticism trait that he can rely on to succeed in the NFL. And like, you're right, like the most fun Bengals gadget player that they've ever had was really, in recent memory, was Andrew Hawkins. And his athleticism definitely translated, because like there would be times on bubble screens where guys wouldn't be able to touch him. But obviously we're talking about a completely different type of player, someone who's completely different in terms of size and athleticism wise. So the ability to do multiple things on the field intrigues me. It's just a matter of if that athleticism is going to translate into the NFL, where it's much harder to make guys miss and go over guys and produce in ways like that.
So I don't like to make excuses for players, but I did watch a little bit of Colorado football this year, and the quarterback, Steven Montez, took a step back from 2018. He missed a lot of plays that were there. And you look at his statistics, never cracked 20 touchdown passes in his Buffalo's career while playing in 12 games apiece the past 3 seasons. So not a lot of statistical production from the quarterback there. Montez has size and all that kind of stuff. That's a different prospect for another time to talk about. But that you bring up a valid point though, John, is is he very, very good for what teams like to do in college, or was Colorado just scratching the surface as to what innovative play callers in the NFL could do with a guy like that? I could see a Cliff Kingsbury along with a Kyler Murray, pairing this kid with Kyler Murray. You've got an aging Larry Fitzgerald, that could be a fit there atop, the second round, because the Cardinals have an early pick there, I think. The Saints, the way they use guys all over the place, he could be a fun player on that offense to pair with Michael Thomas. I mean, you want to give credit to Zach Taylor for having this offensive mind, and Brian Callahan, and they didn't really show much of that this last year. But if they get quote unquote their guys, and these guys that have these type of skills, who knows? Maybe these are the types of players they need to get to create all kinds of different mismatches. This guy, I think, can be that in the NFL. But your concern is valid, John. Is it he's already hit his prime and kind of peaked in college, as they say, or is his ceiling kind of really, really high because he was in a limited offense? We don't know, but I'd like to think it's the former rather than the latter, So, yeah, that's my guy, Laviska Shenault.
It only takes one team to take that chance on him. And for a guy who's had such an interesting career as him, depending on how he tests, it could be a team as high in the top 40. So definitely a name to watch.
Yep. We're going to move on here to a couple of quick awards. Last week we did 2019 season awards. We did offensive MVP, I think defensive MVP, special teams MVP, and coach of the year. I think those were the ones we hit last week. We'll go a little lesser known here, John. I think we can do – you want to start with most improved player?
Sure.
All right. Do you want me to go first this time?
Go first, yeah.
This one's hard for me because there, unfortunately, a couple of the players that showed a lot of promise and a lot of improvement ended up being injured for the team. They ended up missing some time, and that's not that's kind of unfortunate. I'm tempted to go in a lot of different directions, but I'll say Brandon Wilson as most improved. And granted, kick returns in this day and age aren't really thought of as it's not a big part of the game because of rule changes and whatnot. But he was kind of the guy behind Phillips. Phillips broke out and had a few nice returns as well. But Wilson came in there and basically made a bid for the Pro Bowl as a return man. So unfortunately, both guys were hurt during the year and did not end up playing the entire season. But I think that Brandon Wilson showed me a lot in terms of improvement, especially as a kick returner. Granted, that's not necessarily – yeah, you want him to shine there, but you also want him to shine on defense. But overall, I think that's a guy that I would go with as most improved.
So are we doing most improved and breakout player, or are we basically like combining those two as to mean the same thing?
Let's do whatever you want. Let's do the same thing.
Okay. So yeah, I was thinking about if we're doing both of them, then I have to split my answer. But if we're making them basically mean the same thing, if we're using improved as also breakout, then I think the answer to me is obvious, and it's Auden Tate. And for how the expectations for him in his rookie year varied based off of who you talk to. For most fans, they saw him, have some highlights in training camp in the preseason. They thought this guy can be a starter immediately, and then he got put into Marvin Lewis's doghouse in his rookie year. He had that one crucial blunder against Baltimore that basically got him shut down for the rest of the year. I think Marvin Lewis actually called him out during the post-game press conference for that. But what we've seen a lot for young receivers, not named AJ Green, in a Bengals uniform under Marvin Lewis, Auden Tate got that same treatment. But he got a second chance to prove himself, and it was Damian Willis this, Damian Willis that in the preseason. And a lot of people kind of forgot about Auden Tate But when Damian Willis didn't step up in the regular season, it was Auden Tate who did, and basically took snaps away from him. He became the starter over Damian Willis based off of just him outproducing him, and the coaches recognizing that. And in this season alone, he was, by and large, the most consistent and productive receiver when he was healthy. There were times where Tyler Boyd just wouldn't necessarily step up in some games, and he had this stretch of 88 yards, 50 yards, 91 yards, 65 yards in like five of these 6 games. And the touchdowns only came in one game against Arizona, but just in terms of when he was out there, he was consistent and he was doing what we saw at Florida State. Like, this was a player who had a very specific type of skill set, like we talked about with receivers who couldn't necessarily win off separation in college. They went off just out-bodying guys, but we saw that translate very easily in the NFL. And in Andy Dalton's career, he's been more comfortable, just throwing to guys who just made plays on the ball instead of throwing guys open who could create separation. Auden Tate fit what Andy Dalton needed of him perfectly in some of these clutch situations. It was a shame when he got injured and how he had to miss the final few games of the season, and he kind of slowed down towards the end of the year. But there would just be times every week where Auden Tate would just make your jaw drop, and you're thinking, well, this isn't anything new from what we've seen from Florida State, but it's actually being realized in his second year compared to where he was last year to the opportunity that he got this year. He looked exactly as the type of player that you would expect for somebody with that skill set. And it's rare for receivers who are drafted that late to carve out a niche role for him, but the fact that AJ Green was hurt, that Willis was progressing from his preseason stardom, he stepped up when they needed to, and he made a lot of big plays this year. So I think he's pretty easily, for me, the most improved.
Yeah, that's a good one. Where are we going next? We had let's see. I got to get that list in front of me. I should have done that. Do you remember what we had, John? What we had listed
for last year, or last week, or
for this week? For this week, the awards.
Did we do rookie?
We didn't do rookie. Let's do rookie of the year. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll start. I'm tempted to go Mike Jordan because of how low my expectations were for how he finished the year, but I think it's still comfortably Pratt. And I have to give credit to Stanley Morgan too for his contributions to the special teams. But with the way that Pratt fought through a lot of inconsistencies early on, the fact that he was struggling to get out on the field because it was obvious that the coaches didn't completely trust him there. But they said, hey, Preston Brown's gone. You're a new Mike linebacker. We're going to put you where we think you can succeed. And it still was a little rough patch towards the early on of his starting career. But when he turned it on, man, he looked like an actual asset out there. And that's something that we haven't seen from a Bengals linebacker in a long time. He was a guy that I really liked coming out of college with limited starting experience, but you love the athleticism traits. You love the ability to get around the ball, to trust his instincts, and to make actual form impact tackles. And we saw that briefly in the preseason, like, hey, we actually might have a player at linebacker here. And we saw that oftentimes towards the end of the season, quality stops in the run game, the ability to knife through blocks on some of these outside runs, to take on blockers, to shed them, to find the ball. Rare traits to see from a Bengals linebacker, especially when you're playing next to Preston Brown and Nick Vigil, but he stepped up when they needed to, and when the defense really started to improve. As that starting role, got a lot of quality snaps this year. I can't wait to see what he does in year 2, but easily, in my opinion, aside from Sam Morgan special teams, the most impressive rookie I saw.
Going with Ryan Finley. No, I'm just kidding. I will go with Pratt as well. You said many of the same things I would have said. So I am curious, though, as I mentioned when we were doing the roster breakdown, I am curious to see, I kind of pegged him as what Daner did as, a decent complimentary guy in a group, can be a good second linebacker in a group that still needs its stud, but I'm curious to know, maybe he's just a guy that could grow into a stud with more snaps. You mentioned the limited snaps in college, which is true. He was a converted safety, I think, right? Mm-hmm. So, I'm curious to see what lies ahead for him. I would love for him to prove me wrong and become the stud, but definitely a good piece. And, in a draft class that was severely disappointing for a number of reasons, he seemed to be a good find, at least towards the end of the season there. This one's kind of my baby, Unsung Hero of the Year. So a lot of you who read CincyJungle.com, a lot of times we say this is a maybe it's a lot of times it goes to a defensive lineman or offensive lineman. Sometimes it goes to just a backup guy that, steps up because of injury, or, a guy that is a starter but steps up well because of injury. We talked about Mixon being the MVP and all that good stuff, and we hemmed and hawed about Boyd. I'm going to go with Boyd on this one. And not that he's unsung because he had the 1,000-yard season, but, there were some lumps that he took this year. There was, he kind of called out the staff a little bit, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, they get him the ball and things are looking a little better. He played well, like Mixon. Proved that he wasn't just a one-year wonder, that teams didn't game plan for him when AJ Green was out last year, and that's the only reason why. He proved that he can play, and he proved that he can step up. Yeah, he wasn't maybe as consistent this year as he was last year in terms of game-to-game production and big plays, but Mixon got the love on offense. You can even say Dalton got some love towards the end of the year on offense. I usually like to give this to like a Gio Bernard. I feel like this is the honorary Gio Bernard award, but I'm going to go with Tyler Boyd, and maybe I made it a little easy on myself by saying that, but he like Mixon shows the fire in the heart. He seems to like being in Cincinnati, as evidenced by his contract extension that he signed this last offseason. So I'm going to go with Boyd.
I love the logic there, because Boyd is like this core player, but he still did a lot of things that have gone unnoticed, and it wasn't as flashy or consistent as it was last year, but he still did eclipse that 1,000-yard mark, and we have to give him credit for that, for fighting through a lot of the struggles that he had to deal with, Ryan Finley and the struggles of Andy Dalton. So I like that pick a lot. I'm going to go with the guy we talked about earlier in the show, Josh Tupou, just because, the third most snaps for a defensive interior player this year. You had to deal with the Glasgow injury. They didn't really trust Andrew Brown to play a lot of snaps this year, which is kind of surprising to me. But when transitioning to a scheme that we haven't really seen the Bengals do a lot with this 5-2, with this odd man fronts, you had Tupou playing basically everywhere that wasn't an edge defender. You had him at 5 technique, 3 technique, true nose, the 1 technique shaded over the center's shoulder. And he was about as consistent as you could expect for someone playing, 400 snaps, the most, I think, in his career so far. And in a contract year, he did a lot of the little things very well. It was the Raiders game where I really wanted to highlight him in my weekly film review, just of how stout he was against that talented offense, like Rodney Hudson, Richie Incognito, Gabe Jackson, a lot of road grading guys. He stunned them in this place, man. I think he had like 5 stops that game. That was just one of his many great games this year that have gone really unnoticed, because you play between Carlos Dunlap and Geno Atkins, who get the pressures, who get the sacks and whatnot. Tupou is one of their best, if not one of the best run defenders that they had on this team this year. And part of the reason why that, statistic for them in terms of run defense improved as the year went on. A guy who definitely has earned his keep to stay on the team for this year, and for the amount of versatility that they had him use. Like he's this 340-pound guy who's basically pegged as a nose tackle, but you had him playing over the shoulder of some right tackles from now and then, and he still did fairly well. They're a better athlete than I think people give him credit for, and just a guy who's really worked his way into being a great complementary piece. So a guy that not a lot of people recognize when they're watching the games, but someone who's about as consistent as you could expect for one of the worst defenses in the NFL.
And a large human being. A massive human being. I almost want to change my answer, but I'm not going to be that wishy-washy. Michael Flukas in the live Facebook chat says Trey Hopkins is my unsung hero. That is a very good pick.
Yeah,
that is a very not that yours was not, John. Yours was an excellent pick as well. But Trey Hopkins is
no one likes Trey Hopkins more than me. So
yeah, that he and that's part of how this award kind of came. It's a guy that gets overlooked, and Hopkins tended to get overlooked. He was a guy that had to step in and play center because Billy Price was not getting the job done, and he played pretty well and earned himself a contract extension. So he is the team center going forward, and good call by Michael on that. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. He's John Sheeran. I'm Anthony Cosenza. We're going to get out of here in just a minute, but as I mentioned a couple times in the show, get this program on a number of different platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, Megaphone, iHeartRadio. You can get them on all that kind of all those platforms. We have our YouTube channel, so get all the shows on all of those platforms, and keep it to cincyjungle.com for all the Bengals news, opinions, analysis, and insight. So check out what we've got going on Cincy Jungle. Check out our slate of shows, and we appreciate the support. John, it wouldn't be an episode of the Orange and Black Insider without the weekly dose of Bengals cold water, cold bucket of water. Right before we took the air, and we're not going to belabor this point because I don't want to end on a totally sour note, but it was very interesting to receive this. Literally, we were setting up the show, and I was checking my email, and I got this from an employee of the Jim Rome show. That he emailed me a clip. Apparently, Carson Palmer, former Bengals quarterback, was on the show recently and was asked about Joe Burrow potentially going to Cincinnati #1 overall 17 years after Carson Palmer had that distinction. As you would imagine, Carson Palmer did not have the most glowing things to say about the situation, and I want to ask you a couple of questions after we watch and listen to this clip, John. I want to ask you a couple of questions based on some of Carson's comments here. This is a very brief clip. I think it's only about 50 seconds, so bear with.
The expectation is that Heisman Trophy winner Joe Burrow is going to be the first pick in the draft, and then he'll go to the Bengals. You were the Heisman Trophy winner, and you were the first pick in the draft. What do you remember about the entire experience from the end of your college season to the draft?
I remember everybody telling me you can't go to Cincinnati, and I remember I was young and naive, and I kind of loved it. I kind of loved the hatred and the disrespect, because I at that time was saying, I was thinking to myself, I'm good enough. I'll go in there and I'll change it. I'll turn it around. Obviously, I didn't do that, but I just remember as soon as the season was over and I started preparing for the combine, the draft, and all that was coming at me, there was a lot of negativity. I'm sure Joe's hearing that right now. So we'll see. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
So, if you want to call that beating a dead horse or whatever you want to call that, interesting comments, nevertheless, from Carson Palmer. I don't know. One would think you would kind of say, Carson, it's been 10 years, literally. Why don't we move on? Let's change the tone a little bit. Obviously, there's still some ill feelings there, and that's a two-way street. There's no two ways about that. But John, what I want to ask you, do you feel that his assumptions are warranted? In that Joe Burrow is hearing the same negativity 17 years later that Carson Palmer did. You have to remember when Carson Palmer was getting these stay away from Cincinnati, get away from Cincinnati, they were coming off the 1992 to 2002 stretch, not the 2003 to 2019 stretch where there's 7 playoff appearances. So there's a little bit of a difference there, I would think, but the management's still the same. A lot of the stigma is still the same. The team is now coming off of 4 straight losing seasons. Do you buy into the fact that Burrow may be hearing the same chirping that Palmer did 17 years ago?
I don't want to say that you've answered your own question, but you kind of did. But for starters, the only reason why people are still putting a microphone in front of Carson Palmer's face and people like us are still talking about the instances where people put a microphone in front of Carson Palmer's face is because the guy's unabashedly honest, and he's always going to be that way. Like everything that he said there doesn't surprise me because it's basically things that he's already said in some other interviews where he heard, people tell him to not go to Cincinnati because of the stigma, and him being like the guy that I'm gonna change everything. I'm gonna go in there and I'm gonna be the same Heisman quarterback and I'm gonna get him the Super Bowl. And obviously, things don't work like that because the NFL is a lot different than college and management matters a lot more. And like you said, it's not like the Bengals are coming off a dreadful decade like the 90s, but nothing really else has changed. Like they still haven't won a playoff game. Mike Brown is still the owner. They still don't have a true GM. And now they're coming off of 4 straight losing seasons. So the playoff appearances get more and more pushed back into this recent past. So I don't think that Joe is going to be hearing the same exact things because they do have a little bit more organizational stability. They are bringing back their entire coaching staff. They do have more talent on the roster than Palmer had going into 2003. but there's still some GMs out there that's saying like, I don't trust my clients or my players to go to Cincinnati because they're just a second-class organization compared to other NFL teams with a lot bigger scouting departments and an actual GM. So these stigmas still exist. These perceptions still exist. But like you said, it's just not at the abysmal level that it was in 2002 when Palmer got there.
So do you think that Burrow, and I don't want to, again, belabor this too much, but again, very interesting stuff, especially when you're talking Carson Palmer, Joe Burrow. Do you think that Burrow, Carson said he had that fire to change things, right? He had that fire and that desire. I'm going to prove me against the world, the Bengals against the world. And he said himself, it didn't work out. Do you think that Burrow has that same fire? Do you think he has maybe the it that Palmer maybe did not? I mean, I know you were a real young tyke when Palmer came out in the draft, but I mean, do you feel that maybe Burrow is more well equipped? There are a lot of parallels of their college careers, by the way, but do you feel as if Burrow is more well equipped maybe to handle what's going on in Cincinnati, especially with a little bit more recent success than what Palmer was coming into?
I don't know if I can answer that because I don't feel like Palmer was ill-equipped to do it. I think he came in with a certain needed arrogance that needed, a sense of identity that I'm going to be the thing that changes things around here, because I think he recognized that for a team like Cincinnati, who's never going to be these major players in free agency, it's going to take a franchise-changing quarterback to turn things around. And I don't know if Burrow has that arrogance in him. I think he has the confidence in him that he can be that caliber of player. But what Palmer did at the end of his tenure was basically make an ultimatum. And when he realized that he didn't have any of this leverage that he thought he did, he basically threw in the towel and went off to Oakland and via trade. I don't think it's going to end like that if the circumstances go the same with Burrow. But I do think that Burrow does have the same type of confidence. He just doesn't express it in the same ways that Palmer does, because Palmer essentially has never had a filter, and I think Burrow does a little bit better in terms of public relations when it comes to that point. But I think the confidence is still there. It's just filtered in a way that we as football fans and Bengals fans can more successfully absorb and view it as more of a positive thing.
I'll tell you this. I mean, look, Boomer, Ken Anderson, these guys had success in this same small to mid-market team and the way they operate. Granted, different era of football, but they were able to get to the Super Bowl, and they were able to work with the pieces that the team built around them. But I will say this. I can't really think of either a quote-unquote franchise quarterback or otherwise where under Mike Brown that did not every quarterback situation that really readily comes to mind did not end well between Mike Brown and the quarterback. Carson Palmer, you can go back to Boomer Esiason, that ended in kind of a bitter divorce. Obviously, Jeff Blake, that didn't end well. Akili Smith, that didn't end well because Akili wasn't very good. Klingler was in there as well. That same kind of deal. Palmer quits on the team. You've now got Andy Dalton that's a little bit bitter because he is now seemingly out of a job. I don't want to keep pointing to
no playoff wins, none of them.
That's the correlation. So
yeah,
it's just something. It's something to talk about. It's something to think about. Like we said when we were doing the roster analysis, if Mike Brown and company is going to take Joe Burrow, which they, in all likelihood, will and should, they need to protect that asset and they need to give him the best chance to succeed. And that's the bottom line. And, maybe I see some people, Palmer's a crybaby, that sort of thing. That may be so, but I mean, they also, in some ways, shortchanged him. There were some things outside of Palmer's control, injuries and freak things that happened that, but there were some other things where they kind of let that roster erode around him a little bit. And, that's kind of what happened, but two-way street, and he's not letting it go, John.
Nope. Never will.
Probably not. Probably not. Well, we don't want to end on a totally sour note, but interesting stuff nevertheless, and we thought we would get to it, even though we're running long on this episode. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. John, thank you for sticking around, and I could see I've just really downtrodden. You look very down, my friend. I'm sorry. I'm just...
Hey, you try standing next to a skeleton for all your life, sometimes the bad vibes will rub off on you.
Yeah. Well, thanks, man. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Take it easy.